the shovel struck something that wasn't coal. State Trooper Marcus Webb pulled back the blade, his headlamp illuminating what looked like a child's ribcage nestled inside the rotted oak stump. This discovery would unravel one of West Virginia's most disturbing family legacies, a story that law enforcement buried for decades to protect a community already bleeding jobs and hope. Before we dive into this chilling investigation, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story grips you like it should, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's coming. The autumn wind carried the metallic tang of old mining equipment and something else, something Webb couldn't identify but made his stomach turn. Pine needles crunched underfoot as he approached the cluster of hollow tree stumps that dotted this forgotten patch of Appalachian forest. It was October 15th, 1983, and what had started as a routine search for a missing hunting dog was about to become the most horrific case of Webb's 20-year career. The anonymous tip had come in 3 days earlier. Check the stumps near Cutter's Ridge. Look inside the big ones. The caller's voice was gravelly, nervous, a local accent thick with mountain dialect. He hung up before Webb could ask follow-up questions. Cutter's Ridge sat 12 miles southwest of Beckley, West Virginia, deep in coal country where families had carved out lives in the shadows of strip mines and company towns. The ridge itself was unremarkable. Dense hardwood forest, broken by patches of scrub brush and the occasional deer trail. But locals avoided it. File note, October 12, 1983. Residents claim strange sounds at night. Multiple families report children's voices calling from the woods. Investigation warranted. Detective R. Phillips Webb had grown up in these mountains. He knew which hollows held abandoned mines, which families feuded over boundary lines, and which stories parents told to keep children close to home after dark. But he'd never heard anyone mention Cutter's Ridge until that phone call. The first stump revealed nothing but decades of leaf rot and beetle larvae. The second held the skeleton of what looked like a raccoon. The third stump, massive, easily 4 feet across, made Webb radio for backup. Children don't just disappear. Inside the hollow oak, arranged with deliberate care, were the remains of at least 3 individuals. Small bones, young bones, and beneath them, carved into the wood with what appeared to be a hunting knife, were initials: KM, BM, RM, all sharing the same last initial. Webb had stumbled onto something that connected to whispered stories about the McClure family, a clan that had lived deeper in these mountains for generations, surviving off the grid in ways that made even hardened mountain folk uncomfortable. Stories about children who wandered too far from coal camps and were never seen again. Stories that parents dismissed as local folklore, meant to keep kids from exploring dangerous mine shafts. But folklore doesn't leave behind bone fragments and carved initials. As Webb waited for the forensics team, he noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth around the stump. Size 11, maybe 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. Someone had been here recently. What Webb didn't know was that his discovery would uncover a family legacy spanning 4 generations. A legacy built on opportunities that only arose when coal towns were isolated, desperate and willing to look the other way when children went missing. How many stumps would they find before this investigation was over? By sunrise, 6 more stumps had yielded their grisly contents, each one a makeshift grave carved from the heart of dead trees. Detective Ray Phillips counted 37 individual bone fragments before he stopped counting altogether. This wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual, but a systematic operation that had been perfecting its methods for decades. The forensics team worked in shifts, their breath visible in the morning chill as they photographed and cataloged each discovery. Dr. Sarah Chen, the state's lead forensic anthropologist, arrived from Charleston at 11:30 a.m. with equipment that most rural counties had never seen. Her preliminary examination confirmed Webb's worst fears. The bones belonged to children, ranging in age from approximately 6 to 14 years old. But it was Chen's second finding that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Carbon dating suggested the oldest remains had been in the ground for nearly 40 years. The killing had started in the 1940s. Phillips knew mountain families kept to themselves, but 40 years of systematic murder suggested something far more organized than a lone predator. He needed to understand the McClure family history, and there was only one person in Beckley County who might have those answers: Ezra Whitman, the town's 93-year-old retired postmaster. Whitman's house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through a valley thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The porch boards sagged under the weight of decades, and the screen door hung crooked on rusted hinges. When Phillips knocked, the sound echoed through the hollow like a gunshot. "You're here about them, McClures?" Whitman said before Phillips could introduce himself. The old man's voice carried the weathered quality of someone who'd spent a lifetime breathing coal dust. "Wondered when somebody would finally come asking." Whitman invited Phillips inside, where the air was thick with pipe tobacco and the musty smell of old newspapers. The living room walls were covered with photographs spanning 8 decades of Beckley County history: mining crews, family reunions, and town celebrations that captured a community's evolution from boom to bust. "The McClure's been up on that ridge since before my daddy was born," Whitman explained, settling into a chair that had molded itself to his frame over the years. "Always kept apart from townfolk, traded pelts and jerky for supplies, but never stayed long enough for conversation." File note, October 16, 1983. E. Whitman reports McClure family operates as single unit. Multiple generations. Estimated 8 and 12 individuals living in remote camp. No official records of births, deaths, or property ownership. Detective R. Phillips, but Whitman's most disturbing revelation came when Phillips asked about missing children. The old postmaster's face darkened as he described a pattern that had persisted for decades. Coal camp families reporting vanished children, searches that turned up nothing, and a community that eventually stopped asking questions. "Mining families got enough tragedy without borrowing more," Whitman said. "Accidents happen in coal country. Shafts collapse. Kids fall in old mine pits. Families move on looking for work. Nobody wanted to believe something worse was happening." Phillips pressed for specifics. How many children? Which families? What did people really know? Whitman walked to a cabinet and retrieved a leather-bound ledger, his personal record of postal deliveries spanning 5 decades. Inside, written in meticulous handwriting, were notes about families who'd suddenly stopped receiving mail, children who'd disappeared between one delivery and the next, and a community's collective decision to explain away what they couldn't bear to confront. 17 children, by my count, Whitman said. Spread across 30 years, always during the lean months when families were desperate, when fathers were drinking heavy, when mothers were too broken to keep close watch. Desperation makes people blind. The ledger entries painted a picture of systematic predation. The McClures identifying vulnerable families, waiting for the right opportunities, and exploiting a community's willingness to look away from hard truths. But what Phillips couldn't understand was how an entire clan had sustained itself on such horrific activities for generations. What exactly had the McClure family built up there on Cutter's Ridge, and how had they managed to operate undetected for so long? The trail to the McClure camp wound through terrain that seemed designed to swallow intruders whole. Detective Phillips counted 4 deliberate dead ends before finding the path that actually led somewhere. A route marked by symbols carved into tree bark that only someone familiar with the system could follow. This wasn't just a family hiding in the mountains. This was a predatory operation with infrastructure that had taken generations to perfect. Phillips had convinced Sheriff Tom Brennan to authorize a reconnaissance mission before attempting any arrests. They needed to understand what they were dealing with, how many people, what kind of weapons, whether children might still be held captive. The team included Webb, 2 state troopers, and a tracking expert named Dale Hutchins, who'd spent 15 years hunting fugitives in Appalachian wilderness. The air grew thicker as they climbed, heavy with the smell of wood smoke, animal fat, and something else that made Hutchins cover his nose with his sleeve. Old growth pines blocked most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks with depth perception. Every branch that snapped underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the silence. At 2:15 p.m., they found the first evidence of the McClure operation, a series of wooden platforms built into the canopy, connected by rope bridges that would be invisible from ground level. Hutchins pointed out fresh cuts in the bark. Someone had been maintaining these structures recently. "Hunting blinds," Webb whispered, though they all understood these weren't meant for deer. Statistical analysis from missing persons reports. 1945-1983, coal camp children vanished at a rate 340% higher than state average. Peak disappearances occurred during winter months when food supplies were low and parental supervision decreased due to longer mining shifts. The platforms offered commanding views of the valleys below, perfect vantage points to observe the daily routines of isolated mining families. From here, the McClures could track which children walked alone to school, which parents worked double shifts, which families were too consumed by their own struggles to notice a child missing for hours before raising an alarm. Phillips studied the sightlines and felt sick. The McClures hadn't been opportunistic predators. They'd been methodical hunters who understood their prey's behavior patterns better than the prey understood themselves. They turned children into inventory. The actual camp sat another half-mile deeper into the ridge, nestled in a natural depression that would be invisible from aerial surveillance. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, mixed with the metallic scent of butchered meat and the sour stench of poorly maintained latrines. Through the trees, Phillips could make out the edges of structures that looked more like a military compound than a family homestead. Hutchins held up a fist, the signal to stop and observe. Through binoculars, they counted at least 6 buildings arranged around a central fire pit. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and laundry hung on lines stretched between the structures. This wasn't a primitive survival camp. It was a functioning community that had existed off the grid for decades. But what froze Phillips's blood was the sight of what appeared to be a child, a girl, maybe 10 years old, hanging wet clothes on one of the lines. She moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a familiar chore, but something about her posture suggested a resignation that no child should possess. As the team watched, 2 adult figures emerged from the largest building. Even from a distance, Phillips could see they were carrying something that looked like hunting equipment, long-handled tools that gleamed in the filtered sunlight. How many children were being held in that camp, and what would happen when the McClures realized they were being watched. The girl at the clothesline turned toward their hiding spot, and for one heart-stopping moment, Phillips thought she'd spotted them. Instead, she simply stared into the forest with the hollow expression of someone who'd learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. This single glimpse would force Phillips to confront an uncomfortable truth. The McClures couldn't have operated for 40 years without the tacit cooperation of an entire community. The team retreated to a safe distance to plan their next move. Webb argued for immediate action. Raid the camp, arrest everyone, save whoever might still be alive. But Hutchins, who'd seen enough mountain justice to understand its complexities, urged caution. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in terrain the McClures had controlled for generations. Phillips chose a third option: return to town and start asking the hard questions that nobody had wanted to ask for 4 decades. Back in Beckley, the detective began visiting families who'd lost children over the years. He expected denial, grief, maybe anger at having old wounds reopened. What he found instead was something far more disturbing: a community conspiracy of willful ignorance that had enabled the McClures to hunt with impunity. The first family he visited, the Hartleys, lived in a company house that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and the front yard was dominated by a rusted-out mining truck that hadn't run in years. When Phillips knocked, Margaret Hartley answered with the wary expression of someone who'd learned not to trust authority figures. "You're here about Jenny," she said before Phillips could explain his visit. "Took you long enough." Jenny Hartley had vanished in 1978 while walking home from school. She was 9 years old, blonde pigtails, wearing a red jacket that should have made her visible from a mile away. The official report listed her as a probable accident victim, assumed to have fallen into an abandoned mine shaft. Evidence log, October 18, 1983. Monsieur Hartley states multiple neighbors reported seeing mountain people in town day before daughter's disappearance. No investigation conducted. Chief Mueller classified as unfounded rumor. Detective R. Phillips. But Margaret Hartley's real revelation came when Phillips asked why she'd never pushed for a more thorough investigation. "Push who?" she asked, her voice bitter with years of accumulated resentment. Sheriff knew what everybody knew. Police knew. Company bosses knew. Hell, half the town knew the McClure's been taking children for years. But nobody talks about what brings bad luck to the coal. Phillips pressed her to explain. Margaret invited him inside, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fried potatoes. The living room walls were covered with photographs of Jenny, school pictures, birthday parties, family gatherings that stopped abruptly in 1978. Nobody fights monsters when monsters pay rent. The truth Margaret revealed was both simple and horrifying. The McClures had been trading with townspeople for decades. Fresh meat for supplies, pelts for ammunition, labor for tools. The community had convinced itself that the McClures were just another mountain family, scraping by on hunting and trapping. But everyone knew the McClures never brought children to town. Everyone knew their meat was always fresh, always perfectly butchered, always available even during the hardest winters when other hunters came back empty-handed. And everyone had developed an elaborate system of not asking questions about inconsistencies that might force them to confront uncomfortable answers. "My neighbors brought McClure venison to Jenny's wake," Margaret said, her hands shaking as she lit another cigarette. "Stood in my kitchen eating meat that might have been..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Phillips visited 6 more families that afternoon. Each interview revealed the same pattern: Missing children, inadequate investigations, and a community that had chosen economic survival over confronting evil. The McClures hadn't just been predators. They'd been integrated into the local economy in ways that made exposure dangerous for everyone involved. File note, October 18, 1983. Town records show McClure family provided game meat to 14 local businesses over past 20 years. Mayor's office classified relationship as traditional mountain commerce. No health inspections documented. Detective R. Phillips. But the most damning revelation came from an unexpected source. Father Michael Kowalski, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church. When Phillips asked about funeral services for missing children, Kowalski's face went ashen. "I stopped asking where the McClures got their donations," he admitted. "Every Christmas, every Easter, they'd bring enough fresh meat to feed 40 families. Said it was their tithe. I told myself it didn't matter where it came from. Hungry people need food." Phillips stared at the priest, understanding finally how the McClures had maintained their operation for so long. They hadn't been hiding from the community. They'd been feeding it. What would happen when Phillips arrested people who'd been protecting monsters for 40 years? And how many of those monsters were still up on Cutter's Ridge? The radio crackled to life at 4:37 a.m. with news that changed everything. Another child had vanished from the coal camp, this time while the investigation was active. 8-year-old Tommy Morrison had disappeared from his bedroom sometime during the night, and his mother swore she'd locked every door and window. The McClures were still hunting, which meant Phillips could no longer afford to build a careful case. Lives hung in the balance with every hour of delay. Sheriff Brennan authorized a full tactical response. 12 officers, including a state police SWAT team that had driven through the night from Charleston. The plan was simple: surround the camp at dawn, arrest everyone present, and search for evidence of captive children. What they couldn't plan for was terrain that seemed designed to swallow intruders, and a family that had spent generations preparing for exactly this scenario. The assault team moved through pre-dawn darkness, their boots crunching through frost-covered leaves that sounded like broken glass in the silence. Phillips carried a handheld radio, body armor that felt inadequate against mountain rifles, and a sick certainty that they were walking into a trap the McClures had been setting for 40 years. Webb led the first squad along the southern approach, the same route they'd used for reconnaissance. But when they reached the spot where they'd previously observed the camp, they found nothing but empty forest. The buildings were gone. The fire pit was cold. Even the laundry lines had vanished. Tactical report, October 19, 1983. Primary target location abandoned. Structures removed or concealed. No evidence of recent habitation. Search radius expanded to encompass 400-acre perimeter. SWAT Commander J. Martinez. The McClures had either fled during the night or retreated to a secondary location deeper in the mountains. But Phillips noticed something that suggested they hadn't gone far. The hunting platforms in the trees were still occupied. Through binoculars, he could make out human shapes positioned at strategic points throughout the canopy, watchers who could monitor every approach to the ridge. They weren't hiding from the raid. The realization hit Phillips like a physical blow. The McClures weren't running because they felt cornered. They were repositioning because they intended to fight on ground of their choosing. This wasn't a family of backwoods predators. It was a military unit that had been practicing guerrilla warfare since before he was born. At 6:15 a.m., the first shot rang out from somewhere high in the canopy. The bullet sparked off a boulder inches from Webb's head, and suddenly the forest erupted with the controlled violence of an ambush that had been planned down to the last detail. The McClures had turned the entire ridge into a killing field. SWAT Commander Martinez immediately called for helicopter support and additional backup, but Phillips knew reinforcements would take hours to reach them through the mountain roads. The McClures had chosen their moment perfectly, isolated law enforcement in terrain where their superior knowledge of the ground would neutralize any numerical advantage. The firefight lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, 2 officers were wounded, and the McClures had vanished again, leaving behind only spent brass casings and blood trails that disappeared into terrain so dense that tracking was impossible. But the raid hadn't been a complete failure. In the chaos of the retreat, Officer Dennis Wade had spotted something the McClures couldn't evacuate: a root cellar concealed beneath what had appeared to be solid ground. The entrance was hidden under a wooden panel camouflaged with moss and fallen branches, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Phillips descended into the cellar with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The air below ground was thick with the smell of preserved meat and something else that made him gag. The walls were lined with shelves containing glass jars filled with what appeared to be pickled organs, salted meat strips, and preserves that he didn't want to identify. Deep storage for a long winter. But it was the far corner of the cellar that made Phillips understand the true scope of the McClure operation. Dozens of personal items were arranged on wooden shelves like trophies: children's shoes, jewelry, toys, and clothing that spanned decades of disappearances. Each item was tagged with what appeared to be dates and initials, a systematic catalog of victims that turned missing children into inventory. At the bottom of a wooden crate, Phillips found something that made him radio for immediate medical support: a child's jacket, red with blonde hair still caught in the zipper. Jenny Hartley's jacket, preserved like evidence in a museum of horrors. How many more children were still alive somewhere in these mountains? And what would the McClures do to them now that their secret was exposed? The bloodhound picked up Tommy Morrison's scent 300 yards from the abandoned cellar, her nose pressed to a trail that led deeper into mountain terrain no law enforcement officer had ever mapped. Time was running out. 48 hours in these mountains during October could kill a child even without human predators. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a race against a family that had perfected the art of making people disappear forever. The tracking team consisted of Phillips, Webb, 2 state troopers, and Sarah Chen, the forensic anthropologist, who'd volunteered to help identify any remains they might discover. Chen carried a backpack filled with evidence collection tools and a satellite phone that represented their only connection to the outside world once they moved beyond radio range. The trail wound through terrain that seemed designed by nature to conceal secrets. Massive boulder formations created natural mazes where sound echoed in confusing directions. Dense undergrowth limited visibility to 15 feet in any direction. And overhead, the canopy was so thick that even midday felt like perpetual twilight. At 11:23 a.m., they found the first evidence that Tommy Morrison might still be alive: fresh footprints in creek mud, child-sized, accompanied by adult boot prints that matched the impressions they'd found around the bone-filled stumps. The tracks led upstream toward a section of the ridge that local maps listed as uninhabitable wilderness. Incident report, October 20th, 1983. Tracking team identified secondary McClure installation approximately 2.7 miles northeast of primary camp. Structure appears to be fortified position built into natural cave system. Unknown number of occupants. Detective R. Phillips Webb spotted the cave entrance first. A dark opening in the cliff face that had been camouflaged with brush and fallen logs. The air flowing from the cave carried the smell of wood smoke, cooking meat, and human waste. More disturbing was the sound, voices echoing from deep inside the mountain, including what sounded like children speaking in hushed, frightened tones. Phillips made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Rather than wait for backup that might take hours to arrive, he would enter the cave system immediately. Every minute of delay increased the chance that the McClures would relocate their prisoners again or worse. Children's voices in the dark. The cave tunnel stretched deeper into the mountain than their flashlights could penetrate. The walls were rough limestone that wept moisture, and the floor was covered with debris that had been deliberately scattered to muffle footsteps. But what made Phillips's skin crawl was the evidence of long-term habitation. Carved symbols in the rock walls, ventilation shafts that had been enlarged by hand tools, and storage alcoves that contained supplies for extended sieges. 50 yards into the tunnel, they discovered the McClure's true fortress, a natural cavern large enough to house a dozen people, with multiple passages leading deeper into the mountain. The space had been divided into living areas using hanging tarps and wooden partitions. A cook fire burned in the center, surrounded by crude furniture carved from deadfall. And huddled against the far wall, bound with rope but very much alive, were 4 children ranging in age from approximately 6 to 12 years old. Tommy Morrison was among them, conscious but clearly terrified. The other 3 appeared to be children who'd been reported missing from coal camps over the past 18 months. They stared at the rescue team with the hollow expressions Phillips had seen in wartime photographs, the look of people who'd survived horrors that no child should ever witness. Statistical update. McClure operation confirmed active for minimum 42 years. Estimated victim count. 23 confirmed dead. 4 recovered alive. 7 additional cases under investigation. But as Phillips moved toward the children, Webb grabbed his shoulder and pointed to the shadows beyond the firelight. They weren't alone in the cave. Multiple adult figures were positioned throughout the cavern, watching the rescue attempt with the patience of predators who understood they still held every advantage. The McClures had allowed them to enter the cave system for a reason, and Phillips was beginning to understand that rescue might be impossible if it meant walking into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. How many McClures were hidden in these tunnels, and what did they plan to do with law enforcement officers who discovered their deepest secrets? The first McClure stepped into the firelight holding a skinning knife that gleamed with fresh blood, and Phillips realized they'd walked into a slaughterhouse where children weren't just victims. They were inventory being processed for long-term storage. 4 decades of systematic murder was about to end in this cave, one way or another. But the cost might be higher than Phillips had ever imagined. The man who emerged from the shadows looked like something carved from mountain stone. Tall, lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of generations spent surviving on violence. His clothes were handmade leather and homespun cloth, but his eyes held an intelligence that suggested the McClures were far more sophisticated than their primitive appearance indicated. "You boys lost?" the man asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "These mountains ain't safe for strangers after dark." Phillips kept his weapon trained on the McClure while Webb moved toward the children. The bound kids watched the confrontation with expressions that suggested they'd seen this scenario play out before. Law enforcement officers who'd ventured too deep into McClure territory and never made it back out. "I'm Detective Phillips, West Virginia State Police. These children are coming with us." The McClure smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points, a modification that served both practical and psychological purposes. "Children. These ain't children no more. They're family now. Been learning our ways, understanding how things work up here in the deep mountains." File note, October 20th, 1983. Primary McClure subject identified as Silas McClure. Estimated age 45-53. Demonstrates clear signs of systematic body modification, including dental filing, ritual scarification, and possible cranial reshaping. Subject exhibits no recognition of legal authority. Detective R. Phillips. As Phillips listened to Silas McClure speak, he began to understand that the family hadn't just been killing children for 40 years. They'd been absorbing them into a clan structure that had evolved its own savage culture. The kids who survived the initial capture were broken down and rebuilt as McClure family members, taught to hunt, to butcher, to view outsiders as prey rather than people. They'd been creating monsters. Webb reached the first bound child, a girl maybe 8 years old with tangled hair and clothes that had been replaced with crude leather garments. When he tried to cut her bonds, she bit his hand hard enough to draw blood and scrambled backward toward Silas McClure. "That's my daughter now," Silas said, his voice carrying genuine paternal affection. "Been teaching her proper mountain ways. She knows where her loyalties belong." The realization hit Phillips like a physical blow. Some of these children had been captives long enough to develop Stockholm Syndrome. They genuinely viewed the McClures as family and law enforcement as the real threat. Rescue wasn't just a matter of cutting ropes. It was psychological warfare against kids who'd been systematically programmed to resist help. From deeper in the cave system came sounds that made Phillips's blood freeze. More voices, adult and child, speaking in what sounded like a dialect that mixed English with something older. The McClures weren't just a family. They were a tribe that had been growing through kidnapping and indoctrination for generations. Tribal population analysis estimated 12 to 15 adults, 8 to 10 children of various ages. Some children appear to be second-generation captives born in McClure custody. Deprogramming efforts will require extensive psychological intervention. Silas McClure stepped closer, the firelight playing across facial scars that looked deliberately inflicted. "You killed our dogs, burned our hunting grounds, scattered our people. But mountains got long memories, Detective Phillips. We know every cave, every trail, every place a man might hide from justice." Phillips understood the threat. Even if they managed to rescue some children today, the McClures would hunt them for years. This wasn't just a criminal family. It was a blood feud that had been gestating in these mountains since before West Virginia was a state. The sound of footsteps echoed from multiple tunnels as more McClures moved into position. Phillips counted at least 6 distinct voices, which meant they were outnumbered 3-1 in terrain where the McClures held every advantage. But as Silas raised his knife and stepped toward the children, Phillips heard something that changed everything: the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the cave system. Backup had finally arrived, which meant the McClures were about to face their first real battle in 40 years. What would happen when a family of predators was finally cornered, with nowhere left to run? The helicopter searchlight cut through the cave entrance like a blade, illuminating Silas McClure's face as he realized 40 years of hidden predation was about to end in a tomb of his own making. But what Phillips discovered in those final moments would prove that some family legacies run deeper than blood. They run through the very bones of the mountain itself. This confrontation would reveal the most disturbing truth of all. The McClures weren't just a family of killers, but the inheritors of something far older and more systematic than anyone had imagined. The sound of tactical boots echoed through multiple cave entrances as the rescue team's backup finally reached the mountain fortress. Silas McClure's confident smile faltered as he realized the noise wasn't coming from one direction. It was surrounding them. The cave system that had protected his family for generations was about to become their prison. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Silas said, his voice losing its casual menace and taking on desperate urgency. "My great-grandfather started this work in 1897. 4 generations of proper mountain justice, keeping the coal camps clean of the weak and worthless." Phillips kept his weapon trained on Silas while Webb worked to calm the traumatized children. But it was Chen, the forensic anthropologist, who made the discovery that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the McClure operation. Archaeological Survey, October 20th, 1983. Cave system contains evidence of systematic human habitation, dating to approximately 1890s. Bone fragments suggest McClure family operation began during initial coal industry expansion. Estimated victim count: 200-plus individuals across 90-year period. Dr. Sarah Chen. Deep in the cave system, Chen had found something that made the bone-filled stumps look like amateur work. A natural limestone chamber that had been converted into a charnel house spanning nearly a century. Hundreds of human remains were arranged in systematic rows, sorted by age, size, and what appeared to be method of death. This wasn't just a family business. It was an industrial operation that had been harvesting human beings since the coal industry first brought vulnerable families to these mountains. The children they'd come to rescue were just the latest inventory in a supply chain that had been feeding on Appalachian poverty for 4 generations. They'd built a human slaughterhouse. As tactical officers secured the cave entrances, Silas McClure made one final revelation that would haunt Phillips for the rest of his career. "You think we're the only ones? You think 4 families could feed a whole county for 90 years without help from town? Check your police records, detective. Check who never investigated missing children. Check who bought our meat without asking questions." The helicopter spotlight illuminated Silas's face as he smiled with the satisfaction of someone who knew his arrest wouldn't end the horror. It would only expose how deep the complicity ran. Phillips realized that arresting the McClures was just the beginning. An entire community had enabled this operation for decades, and bringing justice would require confronting corruption that reached into every level of local government, law enforcement, and business. Final evidence count: 23 confirmed victims recovered, 4 children rescued alive, 187 additional skeletal remains requiring identification. Investigation expanded to include 47 potential accomplices in surrounding communities. The rescue operation ended at dawn on October 21st, 1983, with 12 McClure family members in custody and 4 children beginning the long process of psychological recovery. But the investigation Phillips had started would continue for another 18 months, ultimately implicating 31 local officials, business owners, and law enforcement officers in a conspiracy that had turned missing children into commodity trading. Silas McClure died in county jail 3 weeks before his trial, found hanging in his cell with a noose made from bedsheets. The official cause of death was suicide, but Phillips always suspected the corruption ran deep enough to reach inside the jail itself. The surviving McClure family members were convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, receiving sentences ranging from life imprisonment to death. The children rescued from the cave system underwent years of therapy, though only 2 ever fully recovered enough to lead normal lives. But the case file was sealed by court order in 1985, and the cave system on Cutter's Ridge was permanently closed to public access. Local residents still report strange sounds echoing from the sealed caves on winter nights, and hunters occasionally find bone fragments that don't belong to any known animal species. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.